Hi, we're going to talk about Mendel's experiments and discoveries. He's actually a pretty interesting guy. So Gregor Mendel studied heredity. Heredity is the delivery of characteristics from parent to offspring. The scientific study of heredity is actually known as genetics, and that's the topic for our last unit, Unit 8. So Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk. He's also termed the father of genetics. Um, he discovered um, basic information about genetics that no one knew at the time, and he presented this to the scientific community. And the scientific community basically poo-pooed his idea and told him that the information was not important. And then about 50 years after he died, the scientific community began to realize what he had really discovered. So Gregor Mendel worked with ordinary garden peas. The reason why garden peas were such a great organism to work with was because they're small, they're easy to grow, they reproduce quickly, and they can produce hundreds of offspring at a time. This made the peas a model system. So these are the reasons why the peas were a model system. Fertilization played a big part in what Mendel was doing. Sexual reproduction is when you have a male and female reproductive cells that fuse, and in the process, this process of the two eggs fusing is known as fertilization, and this produces a new individual. Plant cells actually reproduce sexually. You can have one plant cell that has both male and female parts, but there are two different cells that come together. So this is still considered sexual reproduction, even though the same plant is both the male or both the parent, father and mother of the offspring. So pea flowers are normally self-pollinating. Therefore, the offspring will inherit all of the characteristics from that single parent, but it's still sexual reproduction because it starts with two cells that fuse to become one. Asexual reproduction is when you have one cell that becomes two. So Mendel's pea plants were what is called true breeding. True breeding is an important term you need to know. It means that they were self-pollinating and they contained only one form of each gene, and that'll make a little more sense as we go along. And they would produce offspring that were identical in all of their traits to themselves. A trait is a specific characteristic of an individual, such as seed color or plant height. These things may vary from one individual to another. So, for example, one pea plant could be tall, another pea plant could be short, but both of those are talking about the gene that codes for height. So Mendel decided to cross his true breeding plants. So he had these plants that would reproduce over and over again and would produce the same characteristics all the time. He had these other pea plants that would reproduce with themselves on their own. They would self-pollinate and they would create the exact same plants, very much like clones would be. So he decided to take these pea plants and cross them with each other. So he wanted to cause one plant to reproduce with a different plant. Well, in order to do this, he had to get these plants to not self-pollinate. So what he had to do was he had to remove the male parts. In other words, he had to remove the pollen from one flower, and then he had to take the pollen from a different flower on a different plant, and get it to the female parts that he had just removed. So he cut away the pollen-bearing male parts of one flower. Then he dusted the pollen from a different plant onto the female parts of that flower in which he had just cut off the male parts. So he's using the pollen from one plant and the egg from another plant. Then he had to wait until he got seeds. Then he had to take those seeds and he had to plant them in the ground. Then he had to wait for those plants in the ground to grow up in order for him to see his results. His cross-pollination produced a plant that had two different parents. So Mendel studied 7 different traits of pea plants, each of which had 2 contrasting characteristics. For example, he studied seed color, and the seeds were either green or they were yellow, and he had 7 characteristics that worked very much in the same way. The offspring of the crosses between the 2 different plants with different traits are called hybrids. So you can see here he was looking at seed shape, seed color, seed coat, pod shape, pod color, flower position, and plant height. And you can see that each one of these 7 characteristics was either this way or that. And you can see, for example, seed shape was either round or wrinkled. Pod color was either green or yellow. And you can see how each of these were represented. So when doing genetic crosses, we call the original pair of plants the P generation or the parental generation. They're represented with the letter P, as you can see in the data table. The offspring of those parents are called the F1 or the first filial generation. Now, if we take that F1 generation and we allow them to have offspring, our next generation would be F2, and the next generation after that would be F3, and so on. So you can see from this data table that we got all of one type of each of the characteristics. So for seed shape, we crossed round with wrinkled, and everybody was wrinkled. All the offspring were wrinkled. We crossed yellow with green, and all the offspring were green. We crossed gray with white, all the offspring were gray, and so on down the line. So for each trait studied in Mendel's experiment, all of the offspring had the characteristics of only one parent, as shown in the table. So you can see when we took the parent generation in this data table and we crossed them, we took those 2 characteristics and we crossed them, we always got 100% of the children, or the offspring in this case, that demonstrated one of those characteristics. So you can see for pod shape, we crossed smooth with constricted, and he always got smooth. So in each cross, the nature of the other parent with regard to each parent seemed to have disappeared. So all of the second characteristics in each of these crosses just seemed to disappear, and that made Mendel ponder. He wondered what was going on. So in this case, we're talking about genes and alleles. From these results, Mendel drew 2 conclusions. His first conclusion was that individual characteristics are determined by what he called factors. We now call them genes. So we now understand that genes are passed from parent to offspring. He called genes factors, and we now call them genes. A gene is a sequence of DNA that is passed from parent to offspring, and it codes for a protein, and that protein then determines the trait, like the color of a seed, things like that. So different forms of the gene are called alleles. So if we're talking about seed color would be the gene, and the alleles would be green or yellow. We could also talk about widow's peak. Or shape of the forehead is the gene, and widow's peak is one allele, and straight across, or a no widow's peak, would be the other allele. So alleles are forms of a gene, or a form of a gene. So we have dominant and recessive traits. Mendel's conclusion, or his second conclusion, is called the principle of dominance. And this principle simply states that some alleles are dominant, some alleles are recessive. And anytime you cross a dominant and a recessive, the dominant will always show. So in Mendel's experiment, the allele for tall plants was dominant to the allele for short plant. The allele for short plant was recessive. And that's why all of the offspring, when you take 2 true breeding parents and cross them, all of the offspring will show the dominant trait. So in Mendel's experiment, the allele for tall plant was dominant to the allele for short plant, and that was recessive. Likewise, the allele, as you can see highlighted there, yellow is for seed color is dominant over green for seed color. You don't have to memorize all of these traits for pea plants, but you do need to understand this pattern that you're seeing. So let's try a couple of these. So in genetic practice, genotypes generally come in three forms when we're talking about simple dominant recessive. We have homozygous dominant. A homozygous dominant individual would be represented by two uppercase letters of the same letter. So for example, capital G, or capital T if we were talking about a true breeding tall plant. We also have heterozygous. A heterozygous individual would be represented by one capital letter and that same letter in a lowercase as well. So for example, capital G, lowercase g, or capital T, lowercase t, if a plant was heterozygous for height, and this plant would be tall. Homozygous recessive would be represented by two lowercase letters of the same letter. So in this case, the example I've got on the screen for you is lowercase g. But if we were talking about height, we could have lowercase t and lowercase t for a short pea plant. All right, so let's try this out. If G represents an allele for green, capital G is for green, and lowercase g represents the allele for yellow, what phenotype? Oh, phenotype would be the physical expression of a trait. So what phenotype would an individual with the genotype capital G, lowercase g be? In other words, if you had an organism that the genotype was represented as capital G, lowercase g, what would you see? What would be expressed? Would this individual be yellow? Would this individual be green? Give it a try. If you said green, you are correct, because the dominant allele is always expressed in the phenotype. Phenotype is the physical expression of a trait. Yes, you should write that down. Is the above individual homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive? Since they have a capital G and a lowercase g, what would they be? Hopefully, you said the individual would be heterozygous because they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. They got each of these two alleles from where? Hopefully, you said one from the mom and one from the dad. That would be correct. So is forehead shape a genotype or a phenotype? Hopefully you said it's a phenotype because it's a physical expression of a trait. Is capital A a genotype or a phenotype? Hopefully you said it's a genotype because it's the genetic representation of that individual. So it would be a genotype. All right, now you're going to get to try it. There's a handout, actually there's two handouts called Genetic Practice Handout 1 and Genetic Practice Handout number 2. These are found on Axis under Topics, and you'll also find your plant dissection lab there. And if you have any questions, come see me on Zoom.